Welcome back to the Trackstar Podcast, a conversation about music and culture centered around a playlist I've specifically created for our guests. Right behind me is a nondescript building that's home to a John Varvatos clothing store. But up until 2006, this address was home to a legendary rock and roll venue known as CBGB. On December 10th, 1973, a man named Hilly Crystal opened a music club that was intended for country, bluegrass, and the blues. What no one expected was that this would soon become the epicenter of punk, new wave, and hardcore. While all this was happening, a woman named Roberta Bayley caught wind of the movement and started documenting it all through photography. That decision launched an impressive career that helped her form relationships with bands like the Ramones, Blondie, Television, and many more.
That song really evoked CBGBs.
When you start taking photographs?
I thought, look what's happening. If I don't have a camera, I'm an idiot. Blondie embraced the idea of punk. They wanted to be big. I love the Ramones, I do. And it's not just because I took their first album cover.
Welcome to part one of our episode on a history of CBGB. Roll the intro.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Check, check.
Ready?
I'm ready.
Track start, let's go.
I wish the world could be in these headphones right now.
I'm on the show, have fun.
We're off to a very hot start here. Can you just introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Roberta Bayley, and I'm here to talk about punk rock.
One of the things we want to try and achieve, or the premise of the conversation, is 10 songs that explain something. So I want to get into all those questions, but I also want to work together to try and identify maybe 10 of the most important songs or artists in the punk era.
Sure.
Around New York City, around CBGB in particular. Mm-hmm. And I'll play some songs for you.
Okay.
And you can tell me about them.
Okay.
Or tell me about the artists.
Sure.
Who's your favorite band?
In the punk scene?
Well, both. In the punk scene and just in general.
In general, it might be the Beatles, just because that was the first band I ever saw live. I saw the Beatles 3 times, and I was like a major Beatlemaniac. So they hold a special place in my heart. I can't say I listen to them a lot lately, but I probably know all their music in my head.
Okay. Can you please tell us about seeing the Beatles live? That's
sure.
Not that many people have seen the Beatles.
No, I was a 13-year-old Beatlemaniac, and with my 2 friends, we would just lived and breathed the Beatles. We were going to marry them. I was going to be Mrs. Paul McCartney. My friend Anne was going to be Mrs. George Harrison, and my friend Julie was going to be Mrs. Ringo Starr. Luckily, John was married, so that wasn't an issue.
Off the table.
Yeah, and so we just bought every magazine about them, bought every record. Just were fanatical about it. We were about in the 8th grade, starting to go to high school around that time. And it just absorbed our whole life. We forgot about anything to do with school. I mean, not academically, but socially, because being a Beatlemaniac seemed much more interesting. And first we saw Ringo. There was a time when Ringo got very ill, and the Beatles had to replace him because they'd booked a tour of Australia, I think, and they replaced him, the drummer, and Ringo then was healthy enough to join the Beatles, so he was going to fly through San Francisco. And this coincided with my 8th grade graduation. And we were at the graduation party, and we were just saying, oh, this is horrible. We want to go to the airport. We have to see Ringo. That's what we want to really do. So my older sister said, well, I'll drive you to the airport. So we got in the car. Well, first we put on our outfits, because we all had special mod outfits made and, unique looks modeled after the British girls. And we drove to the airport, and sure enough, Ringo got off the plane, and they walked him through the airport, and there was quite a number of girls, hundreds and hundreds of girls screaming at the top of their lungs, and it was incredibly exciting. We did see Ringo pass by. So that whet our appetite for what was to come. That was in June '64. And so the Beatles played in San Francisco on August 19th, 1964. My father this seems weird now, but he rented us a room at the Hilton Hotel where the Beatles were staying. And they wouldn't let us rent a room on the Beatles floor. They had taken the whole floor of the hotel, but we rented a room on the floor just below the Beatles and stayed in that with my sister. So the four of us were in that room. We had brought all these gifts to give the Beatles, like their favorite artists, like Chuck Berry albums and, stuff I'm sure they really needed. And so we did try to get up to the other floor, but, there was pretty heavy security. And then my father drove us to the Cow Palace where they played, south of San Francisco, and we went in to see the show. They had several opening acts, which they had, I believe, the Bill Black combo. Bill Black had been in Elvis Presley's backup band. I think Jackie DeShannon was on the show, a band called the Exciters that had that song, Tell Him. And they'd play for a very short period of time, but, they had these warm-up acts. And we were like, okay, well, whatever. And then the Beatles came out. It was a 16,000 seat venue, and the screaming was incredibly deafening, like unbelievably deafening. Every flashbulb in the place went off. It was like lit up to an incredible degree, and the Beatles came on stage, and you couldn't really hear the music, but you could kind of make out from the lips and what little bit you could hear which song it was, and we just screamed and screamed, and 29 minutes later, they left the stage. 29 minutes, that was their set. We were completely...
29 minutes of a crowd screaming at them.
Yeah, but, I'd never seen a concert before, and that seemed like, fine.
Yeah.
We weren't looking at our watches saying, we got gypped. First of all, the tickets were $6, so it wasn't, a heavy financial investment. But that's how it began. And then a year later, they came back and they played two sets, a set in the afternoon and a set in the evening. And I saw both of those shows too.
Same effect, loud, screaming
Yeah,
crowds.
well, the difference was in the second show, for some reason, the crowd started moving towards the stage. And so we thought, well, we should do that too. We saw a lot of girls, what the girls would do would pretend to faint, and then the cops would lift them up onto the stage, and then suddenly they'd come alive and like grab Paul. We had rules, and one of our rules was we don't invade the stage. The stage is a sacred place. It belongs to the Beatles. We don't do that. So, but I did move up through the crowd, and I found a chair behind me, and I stood up on it, and I was in the front row, right in front of Paul. So that was pretty cool. And then after they left the stage, we got this idea to go up and touch Ringo's drums because they'd gone. So we did that, and there's a famous picture of me being thrown off the stage by a cop, screaming kind of, because we weren't supposed to do that.
Yeah.
But we did touch Ringo's drums, and we also retrieved some jelly beans and some cigarette butts from the stage, and got some souvenirs, all of which I still have. And that was my Beatle experience.
So from a very young age, you were ingrained in rock and roll. It was a huge part of your identity.
Yes, that's when we started to go see every band.
Yeah.
I saw the Rolling Stones 6 times. I saw, they had those big package shows at that time.
Yeah.
So you'd see a lot of acts do 3 or 4 songs. So I saw the Kinks, and I saw, I can't even remember, but all the British Invasion bands, and then tons of other bands, because the music was very mixed then. There were R&B artists, and, in the charts, just top 40 artists that you would go and see. So it was really exciting to be that young and get to go. I don't know where my parents were, but, we would just take the bus into San Francisco. I lived about an hour away by public transportation. And we'd just go to these concerts, and it was great. And then as that progressed, it became more of the folk rock, and I became a huge fan of the Byrds. They were my favorite band. The Lovin' Spoonful, all of those bands. And then the San Francisco scene happened. And I was right in the middle of that when I was 16 and 17, the Summer of Love, and going to the Fillmore Auditorium and seeing all the Jefferson Airplane and Quicksilver Messenger Service and Grateful Dead, and Janis Joplin. You know, it was just what we did. I mean, the tickets, again, were $2. They had matinee shows. They never served alcohol at the Fillmore, so it was all ages. And I went to the Monterey Pop Festival all 3 nights. You know, we just did whatever we wanted to do to see these bands because we really liked that whole ambiance.
So how did the transition happen for you from a fan of the music to someone who was a little bit more working in it, involved in it, starting photography?
That came much, much later. My interest, you know, I had, my favorite band in San Francisco was a band called the Flamin' Groovies, because we knew them and they were local and they weren't they were a little one echelon lower than the big San Francisco bands because Bill Graham hated them for some reason. But we loved that band and we went to see them every chance we got. And so we eventually got to know them. My girlfriend ended up marrying the drummer. You know, it was made it on a personal level. And then, you know, I went to college and when I was 18 and you know, became a college student, got a job, you know, would occasionally probably go to the Fillmore, but really wasn't pursuing music on that level. My boyfriend was a musician, but he was a blues musician. He played with all black musicians. He would not take me to any club he played at. It was like I was too white and too young. And so, you know, that's what it transpired. Then I went to college and I dropped out of college in 71 and I went to England. And it's hard to remember why. But I just wanted to get out of San Francisco. I didn't want to be in college anymore. I dropped out before I got a degree and just lived in London for 3 years off and on.
Do you think rock and roll inspired that to some extent? The rock scene that was happening there, or the excitement around it? It was like
there was no excitement there. What was happening there was a little bit, Bowie hadn't really started, but like Mark Bolan, Roxy Music were starting, but they were already playing big venues.
Yeah.
I did see the Kinks there, I saw Al Green, I saw the Temptations, but you know, that was just more like going to a concert. And it wasn't my main interest, and I wasn't following any music scene in particular, because there really wasn't one. The local music scene, which I didn't participate in, was pub rock.
Yeah.
Because the bands were looking for venues, just like New York became. And the pubs got the idea, well, if we have these bands, more people will come to the pub and drink. And so we'll make money. And so there was a whole pub rock circuit going on where bands like Brinsley Schwartz and Dux Deluxe and Chilly Willy and all these bands, but I didn't drink then, so I had no reason to go to a pub. I was working as a waitress, I was working in retail. I was just living my life. And at one point I met Malcolm McLaren and Vivian Westwood because they came into my restaurant to eat. It was a vegetarian restaurant. And we became friendly, and at one point they asked me to fill in for somebody who couldn't work on the weekend or something. And so I worked a few weekends there. And I really liked Malcolm, and we really got along. And I was just a girl in the neighborhood, really. They liked Americans quite a bit. But there was no music thing. I remember going to see Fats Domino with Malcolm, and we went to see this band called Kilburn and the High Roads at one point. It was a pub rock band. And then at one point, I started being interested in Kilburn and the High Roads, and I went to one of their shows and met Ian Dury, and he became my boyfriend. So that was my extent, really, of being involved in the rock scene there. It wasn't particularly intentional. It just happened. You know, I fell in love. He fell in love, I guess, and we started living together for a brief time, but Kilburn and the High Roads had no money. They weren't successful. We were living in a squat. You know, it wasn't conducive to a major relationship, shall we say. So we broke up, and I wanted to get out of London, and somebody gave me a one-way ticket to New York. Now, I didn't know anyone here whatsoever. I had some friends from San Francisco that I thought lived in Brooklyn. But really, I just had a list of people that people had given me saying, oh, call Dave, he's a nice guy, he'll show you around. So it turned out that all the people on that list were really nice people, and they showed me around. And one of the first guys was this guy, Dave Knopfsinger, who'd been a sound man for the Rolling Stones and the Who and worked with big bands. And he said, well, what do you want to do in New York? And I said, well, I'd really like to see the New York Dolls, because I've never seen them. Even though they played in San Francisco and they played in London, it was never when I was there.
How did you know about the New York Dolls?
Oh, from reading Rolling Stone, and you know, they were making. That's why I wanted to see them, because they looked like an interesting band, and they were causing a bit of a ruckus and a controversy. And you know, I still read the music papers when I lived in England. You know, they had I just probably the New Musical Express, but you know, they had a big music press there, so you'd pay attention to what was going on, even if you weren't physically following the bands. So I went to see the New York Dolls, and this guy Dave, just coincident, we went to see them at the Club 82, and the Dolls played in drag. Now that's the first time I ever saw them. So they're all wearing dresses.
You weren't aware that that's how they were going to be dressed.
Well, they never dressed like that before or after.
Wow.
But I thought, oh, well, these guys are really weird. You know, they wear dresses on stage. Okay. You know, it didn't shock me, but it seemed a little odd. But then I found out that that was a one-off. Yeah. Because the Club 82 was a famous drag club from the 60s and the 50s. So it's kind of a joke. But the guy, Dave, had a party. He lived in a loft upstairs from the Club 82. Yeah. So he had a party after the show. David Johansen came, this group, the Miamis, who'd opened for the Dolls, came. And I just started talking to people and met people, and that's really how it happened. Somebody said, oh, do you want to go to Max's next week? There's a band television playing. They're opening for Patti Smith. Do you want to go? So, you know, that's how little by little I became a part of the scene, even though, you know, I soon had to go to work. But mostly I got jobs like as a nanny, like living with people, because I couldn't, you know, afford an apartment. But then, you know, after I started to experience this scene, I realized this is a really cool scene. I'd never really been involved in a scene before. I mean, in San Francisco in the hippie era, a little bit, but I was too young, you know. And so this was like people my age that were doing stuff and being creative. And, you know, I thought, this is pretty cool.
So there was something in the water or in the air or in the atmosphere. CBGB is part of it, but the downtown, the scene, as you describe, is part of it, that inspired these people to like come to this place. You know, yourself included. Like, what was it? Was it affordability? Was it like a reaction to how things were? Was it, I mean, New York City was downtrodden at the time, right? It was like New York City was go to hell in New York.
Well, I thought after London, I thought New York was so fantastic. I never noticed that it was falling apart. It was the affordability, which you could get an apartment for $100 a month. That was a big thing. So most people kind of lived in the neighborhood because they could afford it. But it was also is somewhat intellectual without being intellectual. Like the people were smart. Yeah. Let's be honest. You know, rock and roll is always thought of, or by many people, as like dumb music. Yeah. But no, rock and roll, to succeed in rock and roll, brains are a big part of it. Even if you're hiding your brain power, that is what it is. Also poetry, because Patti came along, she was very much of a poet. Television's lyrics were very poetic. Talking Heads more strange than poetic, but it's poetry too. The Ramones, a brilliant poetry. You know, Dee Dee Ramone is just an idiot savant. You know, the lyrics he wrote. So it was all that.
So at this time, was the term punk a thing?
No,
or it's just a scene that comes later? So that was one of the first things you mentioned, was like the idea of punk and where punk started. So when did that arise?
Well, I came in 74 and I got involved with Richard Hell. And so television's manager, Terry York, asked me to do the door at CBGB's, where television was doing a residence on Sunday nights. So I would sit there and ask for $2 for anybody that wanted to come in. And that's how my, CBGB's time started. And, it was very casual. Nobody was coming in. The door take would be $40, split among 4 people. So nobody was getting rich, but, it was basically a place to rehearse, to perform in front of an audience, to get used to that, to practice, to hone your craft. And then other bands started playing there. And so at one point, Hilly asked me they had a festival, the 100 Best Unsigned Bands Festival. And so I did the door for that. And then all these crazy bands were coming out of the woodwork because Hilly's requirement was you had to play original music.
Yeah.
You couldn't be a top 40 cover band. And so it turned out there were a lot of people out there that had no place to play, that wanted to play somewhere. And Max's wasn't really available. Max's was a showcase club. You had to have a record contract really to play there for the most part. It was starting to change. But even like when Patti Smith played there with television, she already had a following. She wasn't a band then. She just had Lenny on guitar. Maybe she had a piano player, but she was mostly doing kind of poetry and, it wasn't a rock thing. So all of a sudden, this magazine comes along called Punk. Now, nobody knew what it was. Punk is coming, as Blondie
There's
always.
like wheat paste around the city that say punk is
Right.
coming.
Yeah.
Around in the neighborhood.
It's in the Dead Boys picture over there,
Yeah.
in the back of them, just coincidentally, because it was everywhere. And Blondie thought it meant, oh no, some stupid new band. Punk. Great. But it was Punk magazine. And they were covering Lou Reed, they were covering the Ramones, they were covering different arts and cartoons and different aspects of the downtown world. So, the media always needs to have a name. And so it became Punk. But then all the bands didn't want to be called Punk. None of them. The Ramones didn't want to be called Punk. Television didn't want to be called Punk. Patti probably didn't want to be called Punk until it became cool to be called Punk. And then she was like, oh, I'm the Punk princess. Nobody wanted to be labeled as that. Blondie, they were a pop band. The bands considered themselves rock and roll, but their own kind of rock and roll.
Yeah.
But the media always wants a label. And it was new. Like you said, the clothes were ripped up and not polished, and the hair was short, and all that. So it's not glitter. So what do we call it? And so it became Punk.
And then is there a musical identity? Because all the artists that you're naming are very different.
Oh yeah,
Right?
completely.
When you think of what's punk rock, oh, it's 3 chords, it's simple. Well, that's not the case of television. That's not the case.
To me, television were almost, especially after Richard Hell left, television was like the Grateful Dead kind of, like a new version of these guitar, dual guitar, and that's what it sounds like to me, just kind of noodling but interesting and great lyrics. I think the lyrical thing also was poetic, but then there was Blondie, and Blondie was very pop. And a little bit of a holdover from Glitter because the stilettos came from that background. Then along comes Talking Heads. Now, what the fuck are they? No, it was like, they were in a way mind-blowing in a different way than the Ramones, like in a more intellectual way. There are these 3 geeky people in Lacoste shirts.
Yeah.
Singing weird songs. So, but, they were fascinating.
Okay, I want us to listen to some music.
Okay.
Here you go.
Oh. That's the Ramones.
Uh-huh.
Blitzkrieg Bop.
Uh-huh. Tell me about this song and what it means to you.
Well, it's kind of the signature song.
Yeah.
I think it's his first song on the album. It's a very upbeat and It's like a, like an anthem,
Yes.
kind of an anthem for punk,
Yes.
if there is such a thing as punk rock.
Yes. And what does it make you feel?
A little bit nostalgic.
Yeah.
I always like it. I was walking in Washington Square Park the other day, and somebody was playing I Want to Be Sedated. And it's just cool. I like hearing music accidentally.
Yeah.
That's my favorite. I don't play music at home, very
Yeah.
rarely. I just like it if I'm walking someplace and I hear, I'm in the supermarket and I hear the Pretenders or, something like that, oh, there's Blondie.
Oh, I love that song, yeah.
Yeah, and just when it's accidental like that, it's always interesting.
So the first question I asked is, what's your favorite band? And then you said punk band or band. We talked about the Beatles, but what's your favorite punk band?
I mean, the Ramones, I would say the Ramones were my favorite punk band. I love the Ramones, I do. And it's not just because I took their first album cover. They made my career.
So so what is that picture?
That was taken for Punk magazine, not for the album cover. It's around the corner from the Ramones loft in a place that's still there called Albert's Garden. It's a community garden now, but it was a playground. It was like an abandoned playground. And we had shot some pictures. We were doing an interview for a cover story for Punk. I think it was number 3 or number 4 issue. And we took some pictures at the loft, but then we said, let's go outside. And we wandered down the street, and there was this playground, and we went in there, stood up against a brick wall, and the rest is history.
Well, so what happens to the photograph? Like, how does it become an album cover?
Oh, well, because the Sire Records had hired a professional photographer to do the album cover.
Yeah. Someone
And-
from Hollywood, probably.
Well, I never found out who it was, but what I've heard is that what they were going for was, the first Beatles album in America was called Meet the Beatles. In England, it was called With the Beatles.
Yeah.
And With the Beatles is a much more elegant cover than the American one because people already knew who they were, so there's less wording and tacky graphics on the cover. But they were going for that kind of thing, like the 3 Beatles, and then Ringo was below, and apparently everybody hated the pictures. They were like, oh, no, we're not using this. So then the record was imminent. It was just about to come out, and they had no art. So they were calling around to everybody, Danny Fields, Bob Gruen, who knows who else had photographed them. And we brought them the contact sheets, and they picked that picture out. They offered me $125, take it or leave it. And that included another picture for the same $125 that they were going to use for publicity from the same session.
But you're not a professional photographer. That's a lot of, and this is a punk, this is a local band. Like, that's a lot of money probably, right? At the time?
No, it wasn't. But I had no choice. What am I going to say, no? I mean, my rent was $125 a month then.
So at least 1 month covered.
Yeah, I mean, it's
you got ripped off, but you also wanted to contribute.
Of course.
To the.
No, it was the best decision I ever made. I've never regretted it, and I never cursed Sire Records or anything like that. I'd had my career for like a month and a half, and all of a sudden I was doing an album cover. That seemed like a pretty good thing, and as it turned out, it was. Because that really has been the most resonant thing in my career. It's on the best 100 album covers of all time on every list you could ever look at. So I'm very happy and grateful, and I'm not resentful whatsoever. That's Richard Hell, Like Generation. That would be one of the originating songs, really, of punk, I think. And I did his album cover, too.
Why do you say that that's one of the original? So I love that.
Television
I love that
was
song, by the way.
really the first punk band I saw, if you want to call them a punk band, which they wouldn't call themselves that. But, I saw them at Max's opening for Patti. That was after I'd seen the Miamis and the Dolls at Club 82. But, they were the ones that created that look. Some of their lyrics were very poetic. Both Tom and Richard have backgrounds as poets. all of those things. So yeah, and Blank Generation is kind of like an anthem, certainly as much as Blitzkrieg Bop for the punk generation.
There was a split with television.
Well, what happened, because that's when I was Richard's girlfriend, Richard used to do about half the songs. And Richard was a little crazy on stage. He would do like these Pete Townsend jump up in the air. And, he had a following of people that would yell out for his songs. And, Tom wanted to be more Grateful Dead-ish. So one by one, Tom would say, let's drop that song. And then let's drop that song. And it was always Richard's songs until at the end, the only song Richard had in the set was Blank Generation. And they never dropped that one because it was, I guess, too popular. But, he just kind of got squeezed out of the band. And that was a shame because I really liked the original television. But, Tom was, I guess, the leader of the band, even though they co-founded it. And, Tom just had a different vision of the band. So and Richard, didn't have a musician background. He'd learned the bass to be in the band. So when they got Fred Smith, who they stole from Blondie, greatest decision Fred ever made, right? Because television was the band tipped for success. He was a much more experienced bass player that played for a long time, much more experienced musician. So that's why they split. And then Richard formed the Heartbreakers with Johnny Thunders and Jerry Nolan. But again, their sensibilities didn't really mesh too much either. That was a great band. They had some great songs, good performances. But, Johnny and Jerry had a different direction they wanted to go, and Richard had his own. And so he needed to start his own band. And that's when he put together the Voidoids, which could utilize all the elements that he wanted, and he could be the boss, and make the decisions and all of that.
I just sonically want to think about how these two,
That's television.
How different.
Marquee Moon.
Yeah.
See, that song really evokes CBGBs.
Why do you say that? Keep playing.
That's, what you heard every night when they were playing. Venus de Milo, Marquee Moon. I didn't like them until much later because I had a resentment,
Because of Richard.
Yeah, I didn't like television for a long time. I mean, personally, I liked everybody else in the band. But, I was resentful of Tom kicking Richard out. Why wouldn't I be? And so, I didn't buy their records or listen to them, but now it sounds really good to me when I hear it accidentally, like now.
So can you paint the picture for us of CBGB, how small it was, how many people would be at one of these shows seeing the bands that we're talking about?
Well, in the early days, it was mostly other bands and their friends.
Yeah.
That's why, if the door take was $40, that means 20 people paid, and maybe there was another 15 or 20 people maybe that came. It's a very small club. The legal capacity was 150. I think at the height of, the popularity of certain bands, they probably squeezed in like 400 or 500 people. It would be like sardines. But, I had the luxury of sitting by the door where there was air.
Spot.
If there was a fire, I could get out. I mean, I very rarely, except in the early days, went up in the front. My earliest live pictures of the Ramones are taken in maybe 76, I guess, because I could get to the front easily. But as soon as they start building up a following and many more people start coming, it's not, I don't, enjoy that kind of thing. I really enjoy live photography, but I want to be in the pit, in the photo pit, which was rarely available to me because I wasn't really good at being professional, like calling the record company and getting the pass, and I didn't know about this stuff. I didn't, play the game well.
What was Hilly like?
Billy was like a big daddy, a big teddy bear. He was a really sweet guy. He was very, he had that deep voice, and he was kind of like a grizzly, and he wore a plaid shirt, and he was just really friendly and curious and interested. He'd been a background as a musician, I think as an actor too, and he'd had a bar in the Village for a long time, and he just, that's what he knew to start up. I guess he had a moving company even at that time, I think. He did different things to make a living, but he really stumbled onto CBGBs because he said yes. He didn't want to have a punk rock club.
Well, what does CBGB stand for?
Country, bluegrass, blues, and other music for uplifting gormandizers.
Well, I don't hear any punk. I don't even hear rock and roll in there.
No, I mean, the first band, not many people know this, but the first band that actually played there before television was Wayne County. It was a drag act with a rock band backing him. I didn't even know about that. I think he maybe played there in '73, but television started playing there in '74, and, they were a rock band, I guess, but they were a weird, offbeat rock band. But then when people would come, Billy that's what he told the Ramones, you're terrible, but you can play here if you want. People aren't going to like you, but go for it. He didn't say, you suck, go away. He just said yes.
Yeah. So one of the reasons the scene takes root at CBGB is it's like there's just like an opening. It's almost like an open mic night situation, and it's a place where you can...
there was nowhere else to play.
Yeah.
That's the thing. Then Max's changed from Mickey Ruskin to Tommy Dean, and Tommy started booking rock bands, and then that became the equivalent of CBGBs. You could play one or the other, and they kind of had somewhat of a rivalry, but literally it was a 15-minute walk from CBGBs to Max's, or maybe 20 minutes, depending how fast you walked. There wasn't any other clubs doing original music, and people kept trying to start up little clubs, but it never really caught on as much as those. CBGBs apparently, I don't know how to judge this myself, but everybody says that had a very excellent sound system. And so that was part of the reason people liked playing there. They had a good engineer, a good sound system, the board or whatever was excellent. So that makes a big difference to bands, so they can hear themselves and develop and expand their talents. And also with CBs, there was no dress code. There was no even informal dress code. You could just come in your most, awful outfit, and nobody would think to anything about it. In one of those books I just read, somebody bought his girl a fur coat, and she wore it to the club, and they said, Hilly got up to her, don't bring people like that to our club. We don't have people like that here. So eventually people who were dressed up and had money and were adults started coming to CBGBs, but not in the beginning.
Did you ever have a moment where you saw somebody come into the club that surprised you, where you're like, maybe there's something here that's catching on, or it started to shift away from this community? Did Lou Reed come in when you were there? Did you sell Lou Reed a ticket? And you're like, that's weird that Lou Reed just walked in.
He would never pay. I didn't. John and Legs met him there.
Yeah.
I was Lou Reed's wedding photographer, actually, but I never met him at CBGB's. But he came there. I think he came to see Talking Heads once. Danny Fields, who knew Lou and was the Ramones manager, I'm sure gave him a lot of information. I think that's what Lou was there to see the Ramones when John and Legs met him and interviewed him for the first issue of Punk. Danny tells me Linda Ronstadt came there, and then she ran out as soon as the band started to play. Paul Simon came. Paul Simon I remember seeing, but it was just.
So, but that's kind of weird. You're like, what is he doing here? He should be uptown or somewhere.
Because CBGB's was, there was a rumor out.
Yeah.
CBGB's was, there's this club down on the Bowery. The word goes out. New York is a small town. In different circles, like in the music circle, people would be saying, there's this thing happening. Because Rock Scene magazine was covering it, and Hipperator magazine was covering it. the cognoscency, the press was starting to cover it. And so it's a new thing and people want to check that out.
So what happens? You go from the door, work in the door. When do you start taking photographs?
Oh, almost immediately. After I broke up with Richard pretty quickly. And then I was working at CB's and I pursued photography casually in high school and a little bit in college, but never had a darkroom, never on any serious level. But I thought, look what's happening. If I don't have a camera, I'm an idiot. It's all happening.
Yeah.
So I went and bought a used camera. And then when I met the people at Punk Magazine, we started working together. I was doing pictures before that. It was my first photo session, which was the fourth and fifth roll of film through my camera, was the Heartbreakers' Blood pictures, which became the cover of Please Kill Me. So I had no idea really what I was doing, but, that was Richard's idea. I followed his concept. I took the pictures. And then I don't think, you talk about fame. I don't think we thought punk was going to last.
Huh.
I didn't, because there was a long fallow period until the 90s when Nirvana came along and Pearl Jam.
Yeah.
And then they were referencing punk. They were referencing that era. And then it started to build from that. But I'd never had a gallery show. I'd never sold a print. I worked for little rock magazines and made a little bit of money, but I never imagined punk would still be around and still really be resonating in the consciousness of rock and roll fans. That's, a happy event that I did not expect.
Okay, I'll keep adding songs and you tell me if they belong on our list or not.
Jesus died for somebody's sins, but not mine.
Oh, that's Patti. This is what I don't really want to talk about, because I liked Patti when I first saw her quite a bit. I thought she was very unique and revolutionary and inspirational and, everything. But as time went on, I began to like her less and less, and that's it. I never bought her records except for her first 45, Piss Factory, and Hey Joe. So I have nothing, well, I do. Never mind. Let's not talk about it.
She's an important...
I wrote her a biography with Victor Bockris for Simon & Schuster. And when Victor was doing the book reading for it, she went down to Tower Records and ripped all the posters down. She's cranky. She can be cranky.
But she is an important part of the CBGB.
I think she
history.
glommed onto that.
Yeah.
She wasn't she was Tom Verlaine's girlfriend.
Respect.
While she was Alan Lanier's girlfriend.
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. She doesn't want to talk about that.
I saw you standing on the corner.
Blondie.
You look so big and fine.
Ex-offender.
I really wanted to go out
Blondie
with you.
embraced
So when you
the idea of
smiled,
punk,
I laid
especially when they went to England, which was where they first made it. They were selling records on the charts, on the television, purely, because of the music, but also they got that break because of Debbie's charisma and beauty, quite frankly. They might have done that without her, I don't know. But, she's also a good singer, and they also wrote really good songs. So, I was very glad that they finally made it. It took a long time, It took a long time, but, great.
You worked with them.
Yeah, I worked for their manager, the first manager, one of their early managers, Peter Leeds, and through that whole recording of Parallel Lines and, when Heart of Glass became, #1 and all that.
Were you a fan of hip hop or aware of the hip hop scene that was happening around the same time?
Not too much. I was a little bit through Malcolm McLaren's embrace of Bombada, and when he was doing Bow Wow Wow, and he brought some of those people to the Ritz. But it wasn't until I went to work for Spin in 1985, and that's when I really started to appreciate rap. I liked rap during that period, Grandmaster Flash and Curtis Blow, and Eric B. and Rakim and, that early rap music. I don't even know what rap music is now. Because
It's just amazing that these things happened sort of in parallel, and there
Oh,
was
no,
some
they were-
interconnectivity.
That was all going on when punk was.
It's
But it was
incredible.
confined to the Bronx, and it was confined to parties. People would have parties and hand out flyers that there would be like a block party. That was when people
CBGB was like
started,
on the street.
Yeah, but the average person in New York wouldn't go to the Bronx. And I think Blondie made it there because they knew Fab Five Freddy, and he took them up there. And, somebody took Malcolm there. It just wasn't, you were probably afraid to go to the Bronx, which is stupid, but, and you also, then as now, I stay in my neighborhood. There was many years when I left my neighborhood, but as I get older now, I'm back to the 10-block radius.
Same.
Yeah. But that's what there was more reason in 1975 to go uptown, because you had to go uptown to see a movie, and you had to go uptown to, do a lot of things. But as the things gentrified, it was less and less that you had to leave your neighborhood. And now I, never do, except to go to a doctor's appointment.
Now there's a Whole Foods. We're just a block from where CBGB was.
No, Wegmans.
Wegmans too. Do you have any Blondie photos? You do, right? In here? Back
That's
there?
Debbie, Coney Island. That's the Dead Boys with Punk is Coming. Let's see. Oh, Joey and Debbie in bed from Munster Beach Party. I have a lot of Debbie Harry pictures. I have a whole Blondie book of just Blondie photos. It's all,
Their music is it's incredible pop music that's irresistible. And I think the same is true of the Ramones.
And it's timeless. And the other thing that's amazing about Blondie was they broke up for 17 years, got back together, and immediately had a #1 record in England. And I find, as is not true of many bands that get back together, I like some of their newer material from the last 5 years as much as I liked their old material, It's unfortunate, that Clem Burke passed, and I don't know what the future of Blondie is actually going to be. They have a new record coming out, I think, in the spring. But, I kind of have been afraid to ask, I know their manager and see him once in a while. I saw him at Clem's memorial. But it's just a question you don't want to ask. There were some great pictures on Instagram of Debbie and Chris, though, with Mom Donnie at his event, and I thought that was cool.
A band like the Rolling Stones aspired to become successful, famous, rich. Did the bands in this scene aspire to the same thing? Did the Ramones want to be as famous as the Beatles?
Absolutely.
Yes, right?
From day one. And I was oblivious to that in my own way because I was just enjoying what was happening. Like, I never thought of Blondie like that. And my friend who, Lisa, who dated Gary Valentine, she goes, no, they wanted to be big. And they didn't act like that. They were so down, I hate the phrase down to earth. I never know what that meant. But, nobody was particularly snobby. Everybody was on the same level. We're all striving. We're all the same. But what I didn't realize is that they all wanted to be successful, because you do not become successful unless you want it. There's just no way. So it never occurred to us, I guess, that Talking Heads would be the breakout band. But look what happened. There was a whole thing going on, and look what's happened to David Byrne since. Obviously he was ambitious, but he didn't seem like it. And that's how I guess I perceived the Ramones. Like, they're just weirdos, They're great, I love them, but they can't succeed.
Yeah.
But then as they started to get more commercial and work really, really hard, which they did, I thought they would make a breakthrough. Television was the band most tipped for success. and they went nowhere.
Yeah.
I don't know why that is. The Blondie was the most unlikely to succeed. Everybody thought, we really like these people, but they're not going to. They're losers. They can't keep it together. Their band is not going anywhere. Well, yeah.
Like what happened?
Yeah, they became huge. So even Patti, I mean, what are the odds?
Yeah.
Suicide.
Favorite bands?
They're great. Underrated.
Tell me about Suicide.
They were just, you didn't want to be in the front row. But yeah, they were really nice guys. I really liked Alan. Marty was very contained. He didn't talk a lot, but when I have talked to him, he's also a really nice person. And I read Alan had a biography that came out, and that's really fascinating because he was a little bit older than everybody else. Not that anybody knew that, but in his biography, he had this whole one life, and then I think he took acid. And then his whole life just completely changed. Like he was a real square, married and, still interesting, very intelligent. But then he just was like, I'm going to be an artist. And he was a sculptor and did fine arts as well as the music. But just a really original guy and a really nice guy.
Maybe there's not enough people taking acid these days.
That could be a problem. Or the wrong people are taking it.
Or the wrong people are taking it.
So messed up, I want you here.
That's Stooges. I saw Iggy in 1970 in San Francisco on a bill with the Flamin' Groovies. And I don't think I really understood him at that point, but then I saw him in London at a famous concert he did in King's Cross with the James Williamson on guitar. And that was a scene to be, it's a famous event or famous gig. And then I just saw him a lot over the years in New York at different times in his career, and just think he's an amazing artist, just did so many different things, worked really, really hard, like unbelievably hard. And still is, which is unbelievable.
He just played at CBGB Fest.
Yeah. I mean, he's a hardworking guy and very, very talented.
What about when you see a Iggy performance, how much is it the music and how much of it is stage presence and what he's doing and how those two things intersect?
It's both. I mean, he's written amazing songs and amazing lyrics. I think he's one of those people that could just write great lyrics easily. I'm not 100% sure if that's true, but that's what I get the impression, that words come easily. He's really super smart. And then I guess, his stage performance comes out of kind of maybe being at war with himself in some ways.
Yeah.
It's a strange persona, but he's very civilized and polite and, not a maniac in most of the aspects of his life, as I've experienced. He knows how to move in all levels of society as a gentleman. Dead Boys. Sonic Reducer.
Who are the Dead Boys?
They were from Cleveland, and they came to New York pretty early. I can't remember if it was their first time or their second time, but the Damned came to New York. They were the first British punk band that came, and the Dead Boys and the Damned did a kind of battle of the bands thing, which I was a big Damned fan, so I thought they won, but everybody else thought the Dead Boys won. But then they went back to Cleveland, and then when they came back to New York, they all had cut their hair, because that's when they had long hair. See, and then they came to New York and they knew, long hair is out. Got to get haircuts. So they did. Elvis, Watching the Detectives, Steve Goulding on drums. Nobody knows that.
How did you become a fan of Elvis Costello?
I met the manager, Jake Riviera, who was the founder of Stiff Records. And Jake, I went to England in 77 to London to just hang out and photograph, but I was going to stay at Jake's apartment because he was going to America. And I went down to the recording studio where they were still recording. Nick Lowe was on the boards, and this guy, Elvis Costello, was in the studio recording part of this year's model, and that's when I met Elvis and photographed him. And then, you know, I went on some of the tour. I would go to gigs near New York and saw him play. That was exciting because I really liked, I wasn't a fan of the first album at all. I thought it sounded like Southside Johnny. But I like this year's model quite a bit.
God save the Queen, the fascist regime.
Well, I went on the Sex Pistols American tour. I mean, of course, everybody loved that album when it came out. We were first we're all buying the singles because we'd go to Bleecker Bob's and they had really good picture singles, and so we'd buy the singles. But then the album came out; it was fabulous. And then John Holmstrom and I got tapped to go on the Sex Pistols American tour. It was paid for by the publisher of High Times, this guy Tom Persad. So that was a whole crazy trip because we didn't really know who was funding us or why, and we were putting it all on my credit card and staying in the hotels that the band stayed in. We met them in a couple of instances, and I took a lot of pictures because unlike most of my photography, this was being underwritten by somebody else, so I didn't have to budget the amount of film I was shooting. So I shot a lot of film. Unfortunately, the Sex Pistols haven't been, not that I haven't sold a lot of pictures of them, but they haven't been like my most commercial subjects. I'm not sure why that is. You know, Sid Vicious was popular for a while. I think one of my most popular Sex Pistols pictures is of the Marquee at the Longhorn Ballroom in Dallas, Texas, which says Sex Pistols Tonight, and then below it is Merle Haggard. So people like the juxtaposition of Merle Haggard and the Sex Pistols. Not that they were playing on the same bill. I think Merle was playing the next week, but it makes for a nice picture. And also the Longhorn Ballroom, apparently at one time was owned by Jack Ruby, the guy who killed Lee Harvey Oswald.
Yeah.
I learned that much later.
Did you continue to follow the CBGB scene as time went on? Like
No.
into the 80s, 90s,
No.
later 80s, 90s? No. You weren't a fan of hardcore?
Oh, no. No. I mean, I like the fact that it exists.
Yeah.
And Henry Rollins was one of the first people to buy my Ramones picture when it was only $400. But no, I didn't. I mean, to me, that's a very male music, not to be a sexist, but, you know, I don't like, I wouldn't
the
be
aggression
big
thing.
on the mosh pit. You know, that would not be my, I mean, that's really why I almost stopped doing live photography because you know, it's just not my thing to be pushed around. Somebody ripped the sleeve off my cashmere sweater at a Clash concert, you know, and I was pissed off. So it's just not my thing. But no, I barely went there. And after I went to work for Blondie, I went back to see X-Ray Specs. I remember every once in a while I'd stop by, but no, I was out of there. No offense to CBGBs, you know, but it just, you know, it was where I worked.
Yeah.
I mean, did you go back to your first job?
My first job was a pizzeria.
Yeah, and when
And
was
it's
the last time
terrible
you went
pizza.
back?
No, I don't go.
Yeah, okay. We have something in common.
I mean, the music changed too. It wasn't the same stuff that you were listening to. I mean, none of it wasn't, and none of it was the same. Like we talked about, there isn't like a one coherent sound and style. We talked about 5 different bands with 5 completely different sonic identities.
It might be different bands and different styles. I just, you know, I kind of moved over to the British like Stiff Records people and started following Elvis Costello and Rockpile and different bands. But I like seeing bands in the early days when they're not playing big places. Like I, would see Elvis in a small club and Rockpile in a small club, and that's what appeals to me. I don't go to those big places. I mean, I have to see Prince.
Yeah.
But yeah.
What other bands should we include in our list? Do you have any others that we?
Well, see, I certainly don't think Elvis Costello was punk.
Yeah.
I mean, my favorite band from that time is Rockpile.
Yeah.
I love them. That was sad when they broke up. I just thought it was such a good combination of talents, and I just loved seeing them. They were my favorites, really. I loved the Buzzcocks. They were really great. I think that of them as punk. But, I love Squeeze, but I don't think they were punk. They were a pop band.
So, well, what about Blondie? Blondie and
I don't
Squeeze
think they were a punk. I think they got lumped in, like I said, because they were integral to Punk magazine. Chris wrote for the magazine. Debbie appeared in the magazine a lot. They were really involved with the magazine. Wasn't really to their advantage. It wasn't like Punk had some major distribution or anything. It was just like a cult magazine, but they just participated and liked doing it. But no, were they punk? No. Nobody. I don't even think, the Ramones, maybe at some point they just gave up and said, okay, but
Sure.
They wanted to be a rock band. And punk, punk, whatever it is, did start in New York, but the London scene embraced it, and it became a thing there where bands really tried to be a certain style and aped a certain style of dress and of music, and and that's probably what happened in New York too. But I'd already gone by then, I'd already split the scene.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
That was really fun.
Okay. She really wants to go.
The Trackstar Podcast is a presentation of public opinion created by me, Jack Coyne, Kieran Coyne, and Henry Cornaros. Written and produced by Noah John. Edited and produced by Haley Sobel. Theme and original composition by Kieran Coyne. Mixing by Devin Klein. Our agent is Joanna Orland at UTA. Thanks for listening. See you next Wednesday.